welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's parsha is Balak and includes a blessing about goodness, delivered by a prophet of the nations that is so inspiring, it is used to initiate the morning prayers in Jewish houses of worship of every denomination and until today. This week, another 20-something kid took a gun and killed and tried to kill. A New York Times editorialist wrote that, though details remain sparse, this appears to be a story less about fanatical partisanship than about the crisis of lonely and disconnected young men being radicalized into pure nihilism. So, we celebrate the simple good of pitching a tent and sitting with one's fellow. So join us for How Good Is That? So, Rabbi, welcome back from Sag Harbor. Initially, when I started thinking about the theme tonight, I thought about what the big event in my life, which was that I had an accident when using a tool. They say Jews and tools don't go together. And I ended up in the emergency room and I had an operation, and I am so fortunate. And when that happens, you just want to be thankful for the good in the world, for the good of the doctors and their teams and people that help you. But as I progressed, I read that editorial in the New York Times, and I realized that, you know what, it's bigger than me. There's something about just celebrating good that we are desperately lacking in our world. And so tonight, I'd love to be disruptive, and maybe we will be a little disruptive, but what we're really going to do is explore this prophecy of a prophet of the nations named Bilam that talked about how good is it to sit in your tent. And we're going to discuss what good is and what the power of good is, and maybe what the antidote of good is. So are you ready to join
I'm ready.
good
Let's
train?
Go. I'm ready.
Okay, so we are in Numbers 24:1, and it says, Now Bilam, seeing that it pleased God to bless Israel, did not, as on previous occasion, go in search of omens, but turned his face toward the wilderness. As Bilam looked up and saw Israel encamped, tribe by tribe, the Spirit of God came upon him. Taking up his theme, he said, Word of Bilam, son of Beor, word of the man whose eye is true, word of one who hears God's speech, who beholds visions from the Almighty, prostrate but with eyes unveiled. And here he goes. How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkenotecha Yisrael. Like palm groves that stretch out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by God, like cedars beside the water. Their boughs drip with moisture, their roots have abundant water. Their ruler shall rise above Agag, their sovereignty shall be exalted. God, who freed them from Egypt, is for them like the horns of a wild ox. They shall devour enemy nations, crush their bones, and smash their arrows. They crouch, they lie down like a lion, like a lioness who dares rouse them. Blessed are they who bless you, accursed they who curse you. And as I've been doing in the last few parshiot, we're taking something out of context. We're not going to get into the whole long story of a talking donkey and how we got here. We're just going to look at this parsha, this little segment that talks about this amazing prophecy / blessing that has really grown legs. As I said, it's the first prayer that we say when we come into the synagogue. In many synagogues, it's written over the Aron HaKodesh or on the bima. It is truly an amazing prayer written and popularized by a prophet of the nations. It's amazing, isn't it?
It is amazing. I mean, and that's the real question. How could it be that the most famous verse in the Torah was popularized by a prophet of the nations who wasn't even really good for the Jewish people?
So I have put in the notes 2 articles that are on our favorite site, thetorah.com. One is called Bilam and the Problem of Other People's Revelation, and the other one is Bilam the Seer is recast as a villain. So what they argue is if you just look at these verses by themselves, he's not considered a villain. If you look at Numbers 24:15 through 16, he took up his theme and said, "Word of Bilam, son of Beor, the word of the man whose eye is true, shetum ha'ayin, word of one who hears God's speech, shomea imre el v'yodea dat elyon, he obtains knowledge from the Most High." If you just read the verses that we've read now, there doesn't seem to be anything negative about Bilam, which in a sense, Rabbi, if you think of the fact that we use his prophecy, there's a certain logic to the fact. I mean, you can always make the case it's the song, not the singer, so to speak. But in this case, if you read just these verses, if it is a profound message, and we'll try to delve into what the message is, this is a guy whose eye is true, who hears God's speech and obtains knowledge from the Most High. We can discuss another time maybe how the tradition later on put him into a negative position or didn't give him his credit, maybe a little bit like Jethro, but I think for the purposes at hand, it certainly says some nice things about him, especially in terms of his prowess, his power to say words that have had such a impact on our people.
Yeah, I mean that's an important point. You see, I have a bigger question, which I'm sure will lead into what you're going to talk about. Why does the story of Bilam even make it into the Torah? Why does it make the cut? It actually is kind of one big parenthesis to the story. You know, the story of the desert. There's spies and Korach and Moses hitting the rock. And next week, Moses appoints a successor, which is Joshua. Why? Where does Balak come from?
So I don't normally listen to other podcasts on the parsha before we broadcast, but I saw that there was a podcast with Everett Fox, and I listened to it, and he kind of asked the same question, and his answer is, with all this negative stuff that we've been going through, whether it's the spies, whether it's Korach, whether it's hitting the rock, the Jewish people, Israelites, needed a little bit of chizuk, and of course, the only strength and positivity that you can get from this story is not the backstory of trying to curse Israel. It's the punchline, which are these verses. And these verses are a light within so much of the negativity and the darkness. They must have given the Israelites, as they were beginning the process of understanding that they would have to wage war, that they were not going to just be let in and to come home to their land. This was going to be a struggle. They had this Bilam say to them, "Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov," how amazing you people are. Because at the end of the day, it's almost like a pep talk, isn't it?
It really is. So you're saying that it's for the sake of the people. The people needed a pep talk. You know, they always say, and I'm sure this is true, that, you know, it's okay to be complimented by your friends, but when your enemies compliment you, that's really good.
You know, I was almost thinking of having the whole podcast just on that, meaning to say there are things that have been said about the Jews that we have almost taken as a badge of courage, or whether it's the wandering Jew that we covered in a previous episode, or whatever it might be. And I thought that was in this category. And yes, we're going to see, even in the commentaries, there is that aspect of this. I mean, mean, we Jews today are exactly the same. If a celebrity or an influencer who's not Jewish says something nice of us, it has so much more purchase than if one of us says that. I mean, I think it's natural, right? I mean, he's objective.
Right. I mean, that's what I'm saying. That comment is not so surprising. It's true. What's interesting is that the Torah includes it. That's interesting.
Yeah. So following on those scholars who believe that actually there were this text evolved over time, and for whatever reason, and I'm not going to get into the reason, you can read those scholarly articles, over time Jewish texts put Bilam into a bad context. The looking at the psukim that we just read is very positive, and there seems to be a thread even within rabbinic literature that sees it as positive. Now, in the Sifrei Dvarim 357, chapter 357, if you check out 357, it's the last chapter in Sifrei Devarim. It's the end of the book, and it's when Moses has died, and it says there was no one like Moses. And the Sifrei says, and there shall not arise in Israel again a prophet as Moses. That's the quote. And the Sifrei continues, but among the nations there did arise. And who was he? Bilam, the son of Bor. But there is a difference between the prophecy of Moses and the prophecy of Bilam. Moses did not know who was speaking to him, and Bilam did know, and it quotes our pasukim. The speech of the hearer of the words of the Almighty, Moses did not know when he would speak until he did so. Bilam knew, and the knower of the knowledge of the Most High, again quoting from our psukim. Moses did not speak with him unless he was standing, and Bilam spoke with him when he was fallen. The vision of the Almighty shall be seen fallen in his eyes uncovered. To whom may he be compared? And it's talking about Bilam, I believe. To the king's cook, who knows the expenses of the royal table. He compares letavcho shel melech v'yodea kama hotzaot yotzot lemelech al shulchano. Here is the last Sifrei in the Torah, and it's commenting on the pasuk that says there has never arisen a prophet such Moses in Israel, and it makes a diuk and says, in Israel, yes, but in the world, there was Bilam. This is revolutionary.
It's revolutionary. These midrashim about Bilam are revolutionary, every one of them.
So the next one is fascinating. In the Jerusalem Talmud Brachot, it has a variation, a longer variation than what's in the Babylonian Talmud. And it says, Rabbi Samuel bar Nachman, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda bar Zebidah, said, it would have been logical that one also would have to recite the chapter of Balak and Bilam every day, meaning during the Shema. Right now, we have three different paragraphs that we recite after the Shema every day. If you only say one prayer a day, you're supposed to say the Shema and these three paragraphs. And the rabbis are saying that actually this Ma Tovu or Halecha should be part of that. Why does one not recite it? Not to accommodate the public too much. Shelo latriach al hatzibur. So this is a subject for another podcast, that there was a time where rabbis did not add prayers and add hours of our time in synagogue because they actually cared about inconveniencing the kahal, the tzibur. But be that as it may, they said, we have three paragraphs. We shouldn't add a fourth with Ma Tovu because it's too much. We'll add too much. But it begs the question of why they would want to add it. So Rab Huna says, why would you want to add it? Because it says lying down and standing up. So if you recall when I said the verse, in verse 9, they crouch, they lie down like a lion, like a lioness who dares rouse them. So simply because it talks about a lioness going down and coming up, we think about uv'shaktecha uv'kumecha, that when you lie down and when you rise up, you should say these words. Rabbi Yossi Bar Arabun said, because it contains the exodus of God and God's kingdom. So we know from the Haggadah, the reason we talk about the tzitziot even at night is because it includes a reference to the Exodus. Rabbi Eliezer said because it is written in the Torah, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, that because reference is made to Bilam in all three of the various renderings of Tanakh, that's why you should say it. I'm not that impressed by the answers. We're going to find out that there were other answers given. But again, getting back to the value and the esteem that Bilam was held in, there was a thought that we would be saying these verses every morning and every night as we rise up and as we go to bed. It's pretty powerful.
It's remarkable is what it is, right? I mean, that these verses are as important as the Shema.
So I always believe that there's a genius to the Jewish people, and that when you have a question like this, it's not necessary in terms of the answers, because what they're asking is, this is what the Jewish people do. Why is it so important? And it's possible that they might have lost the reason, but the value is still there. So I came across another Sephirah Notes who quoted from the Pre-Eights. It's written by Chaim Vital, who was a Kabbalist in the 16th century. And he writes as follows. It is necessary, after one sits in the synagogue, before he begins to pray at all, and particularly at the morning prayers, that he accepts upon himself the yoke of the command to love one's neighbor as himself. Now, Rabbi, you and I both know that that's a signal, because when you say the Shema, the key is that you are being makabel Ol Malchut Shamayim, the yoke of heaven. And here he says, Tzurich sheikabel alav mitzvot v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. So he's saying when you walk into synagogue, and we're going to get to the point where he is intentioning this matovu moment, you have to accept upon yourself the yoke. Who knew there was such a yoke? To love one's neighbor as oneself, and to focus his attention on loving every Jew like himself. Since in this way the combined prayers of all Israel will rise and bear fruit and succeed. And it is forbidden for a person to pray before God in sadness, rather as a servant serving his master in great joy. For if not, there is no power in the soul to accept higher inspiration that comes as the result of prayer. To pray, you cannot have sadness. And it is only appropriate to be sad at the moment of the vidoy of confession. But for all other prayers, he should not place opposite his eyes any sadness, even regret over sins committed. And this is a huge concept and something one must keep in mind. It is invaluable. So it is amazing that he combines this sense of loving one's neighbor as oneself with the opposite of sadness. We started in the notes, I talked about the commentator in the Times who talked about the crisis of lonely and disconnected young men being radicalized into pure nihilism. The combination of being able to say ma tovu, how good are these tents, and the fact that tents are places that people live. Tents are community. He combines this concept of being happy to serve one's maker, to be a creation of God, and loving one's neighbor and having the most basic social skills. This just blew me away.
That's remarkable. Now, I have a question to ask you. Do you think tents are different than homes? You think there's something there?
So, he hasn't really gotten into ohel or tent from that regard.
Right.
But I do think that tents and Mishkan, and we're going to get into the fact that labor rabbinic commentaries didn't associate them so much with domiciles, but they related them to synagogues and houses of study. But however you take it, Rabbi, you can't think of it in terms of ohalot. Tents in the plural is a community. There's definitely this sense of Bilam looked at these people who clearly had their deficiencies. They sent the spies. They had the Korach, getting back to Everett Fox's comment. But how goodly are your tents? You are a community. If I had to talk about this matovu, good, I would say there was a book called Good to Great. We don't have to be great. Sometimes we just have to recognize the good. And this is what it's about, that we have community. That's how I read into this. But this old mitzvah, the ahavta l'reacha kamocha, the accepting upon yourself first, before you start your prayers, before you really enter the synagogue, to accept upon yourself the yoke, the burden or the liberation of loving one's fellow as oneself, I just was blown away with.
I love that. That's really beautiful. Wow. Okay. There's the reason that they include this in the Torah.
So he doesn't make the connection to the matovu. But the same source sheet that I looked upon quotes a Sidur Sephard upon arising Hashkamat HaBoker Seder Halichat Lebeit HaKnesset. And it says, before beginning the morning prayers, you should say the following. Hareini mikabel olai mitzvat aseh shel v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. I hereby accept upon myself the positive commandment to love my fellow Jew. And of course, Rabbi, you and I can say v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha really means my fellow. It's open for interpretation if it's my fellow man.
That's good also.
It's my family member, how large that community is. And then it goes on, the following verses from Scripture are recited upon entering the synagogue. How good are your tents, Jacob? So at least in the rendering in this Sephardic Siddur, Nusach Sephard, it does make the direct connection between accepting upon yourself the yoke of loving one's neighbor as oneself and saying, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob, the dwelling places of Israel. So I find, and credits to the other Sephirah notes who made this connection, it is clear that this is the verse. And of course, if that takes you back to what the rabbis were discussing about putting this prophecy into the Kriyat Shema, which is about Mikabel Ol Malchut Shemayim, accepting upon you the yoke of heaven, you cannot but say that Chaim Vital and this Sephardic Siddur are literally saying the reason it belongs in the Shema is because you have to accept the Ol Ahavta L'Reacha Kamocha along with the Ol of Malchut Shemayim. You have to accept loving your neighbor as yourself, loving joy and positivity and communion with other people, along with accepting God. I think it ties the knot, and it literally is an answer to that Talmud Yerushalmi and Bavli about why you would think of putting these verses into the Kriyat Shema instead, morning and light.
I think that's really nice. I mean, that's really, it's interesting that there isn't a discussion about putting the ahavta l'reacha kamocha in the daily service. It's only this which represents that love that we put in the daily service. Isn't that interesting? Why don't they say we should put love your neighbor as yourself into the daily service?
I think that's a wonderful question. It's almost like it came in through the back door. It came in surreptitiously. We had to discover it through Chaim Vital and Nusach
Right, isn't that
Sephard.
so interesting?
So that kind of goes along with what the scholars are saying in the Torah.com 2 articles that I referenced. And what they said, and it's understandable, that as the Jewish people went into exile and were continually persecuted, they started to close ranks. And they started to take, whether it's a verse like loving your fellow as yourself and making it relate to Jew. Also, when it came down even to matovu or halecha, I've been taking liberties and saying it means your fellow person, your co-communal, sharing, tent-bearing person. If you look at Rashi's on Numbers, how goodly are your tents, how goodly are the tent of Shiloh and the temple, meaning in temple in Jerusalem. All of a sudden you see the commentaries who are particularizing it, who on the one hand are particularizing Bilam as a prophet of the heathen who was forced to say this, became a forced mouthpiece of God, and on the other hand taking his prophecy and his blessing and particularizing and contracting it and constraining it. You said a second ago in the beginning of our podcast how you can tell it's different when your enemy blesses you. The Talmud in Sanhedrin says, Rabbi Yochanan says, from the blessing of that wicked person, meaning Bilam, you can ascertain what was in his heart. He sought to say that they should not have synagogues and study halls. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob? You can realize from that he did not want, he understood the secret source of our people, and he had in his mind to curse those tents and those tabernacles. That is our strength. So again, they took it into the realm of polemic, and in a sense, they constrained it, and in a sense, that might lie behind why they didn't put flagrantly love your neighbor as yourself, because it's hard to love your neighbor as yourself when you have a pogrom and when the rules that you live under are different from the rest of the population. It's natural, but it is kind of what it is.
Well, you know that Rabbi Akiva famously says, love your neighbor as yourself. Doesn't mean actually you love your neighbor yourself. You can't really do that. But don't do to other people what you would not want to have done to you.
And again, he turned it around as a negative, but even that talks about a victim. Don't remember that you're a victim and never victimize as a result of it. I think that's absolutely beautiful. So I started thinking about Matovu, and of course, I called the name of this episode, How Good Is That? Because Matovu means how good. It is just an open-ended assertion of things are good, and we've got to recognize the good. And it occurred to me that there's another very famous pasuk that uses the same type of phrase, and it's Psalm 133. For those of you who have trouble with long psalms, this psalm is 3 verses, and it says, the Song of Ascents of David, Ma tovu umanaim shevet achim gam yachad. How good and how pleasant it is that brothers dwell together. It is like fine oil on the head, running down on the beard of Aaron that comes down over the collar of his robe, like the dew of Hermon that falls upon the mountains of Zion. There the Lord ordained blessing and everlasting life. So here too, we have another iconic verse that has stood the test of time. It was impactful when it was written in the Psalms, but up until the Zionists and the Chalutzim, it was a song of how amazing it is when brothers and sisters, when whether it's co-kibbutzniks, whether it's idealists, whether it's people that share a vision where it's humankind sit together. It's not a very high reach. It's not saying how goodly it is when world peace exists. My point tonight is the idea of good, and good is something that we get right from the beginning of Genesis when God says that's good and that's good. It's just that base recognition of it's good. We live in a world, it seems to me, where everybody thrives on trading bad news. And if these kids that we talk about that ultimately take a gun and start shooting people up and they become nihilists, it's because they live in a culture that thrives on bad news. And I think if the words of Bilam are as high, or if not higher, than anything that Moses ever said, it's because it sets the bar, I wouldn't say low, because once you understand it, it is oh so powerful, but it's just recognize the good of human communality, of being together. It's just such a powerful message. Blows me away.
Fantastic. This was great. And you started by saying that, that this is a week of gratitude. And you really, not only did you choose a verse that represents gratitude, but you have a whole explanation, a Kabbalistic explanation and a regular explanation that all come back to the same point. So I think that on this week, we can all be grateful, and you could be especially grateful. And all of us in Madlik wish you a refuah shlema. You should feel better quickly, and you should get back to the swimming pool and the tennis court and all those things as quickly as possible. And it's nice to know that, injured or not, Madlik keeps on going.
Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege, a joy. It is good to be here. So let's all praise the good, thank the good, share the good. Start out your day by sharing good news, not bad news. Look at the world half full and not half empty. If you want to pray, understand that you can't pray unless you're joyful and not contrite. It's a very powerful image, and if we have to thank Bilam for that, thank you, Bilam. That's as good as it gets. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Be well. Bye-bye.